Last time, we looked at the candle lighting blessing and saw what we could learn about God from that. And tonight we have a related one. Gary, would you be willing to read this text, please?
Yeah. Praised are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who creates the fruit of the vine.
Thank you. And I'll read the Hebrew and then I'll let you go into the next part. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei peri hagafen.
I could have done that.
I'm sure you could have. As I said last week, I am choosing to read the Hebrew because I don't want anybody to feel embarrassed about their Hebrew reading skills or not. So I just put it at an even playing field. All right, please go on with the English.
Oh, here's some transliteration. This is the blessing for grape juice and wine. It doesn't have the Asher Kishano Umitzvatav Tzivanu phrase because it is thanking blessing, not a doing blessing. This blessing is an acknowledgement that unlike the creation of fake grapes, growing real grapes involves factors outside of human control. Because Jews don't have a different God for rain versus sun versus the earth, all compliments and complaints get addressed to God. Does this way of thinking about God work for you?
Okay, thank you.
It works for me in one of two ways. Either God is doing everything, micromanaging, or when God created the universe, he set certain laws, what we call laws of science, in motion so that the earth would behave in a certain way. And all this is the result of the fact of the way he put things into motion to begin with. And it's not micromanaging.
I would say God is the master of multitasking.
Did I hear hope past or did I?
Oh, multitasking.
Oh, multitask. Okay.
I just want to know how I've gotten to almost 71 years old, and I'm only now learning that we put into prayers Asher Kiddushanu B'mitzvotav V'tzivanu when it's a doing blessing, or, things that we do. So thank you, Dave.
No problem.
I still want to know how we can bless God. Praising God, yes, but I see connotation difference between the two words, even though we discussed it before.
Mm-hmm.
Bless my kids to have a good life. I don't bless God to have a good life. That wouldn't mean much.
I'm not sure that we are blessing God in this one. It's a blessing over the grape juice in which we are praising God.
I look at it that this blessing, just like the Motzi, shows a partnership between humans and God, because God, grows the grapes, if you will, but we have to make it into wine. The wheat, we have to make it into flour and then into bread. So it's recognizing God kind of originating these things, but if we didn't have human interfaith with this or interaction with this, then we couldn't really have wine or challah or that sort of thing.
No, but you could eat the grapes and still say, would you say the same blessing? If you're bringing forth the fruit of the vine.
Oh, well, I guess that's a good point. But okay, what about Motzi though? Would you say the blessing?
No, I understand what you're
flour
saying.
in your mouth? If you're just chomping on a wheat stalk, Charles, would you say a blessing on that?
Yeah. Well, it's still, you need the wheat stalk. So the seed, I'm just saying there's.
I'm just giving you a hard time. But I always like
a hard time.
the
And you're
idea.
right, there is a difference.
Yeah, I mean, because you could argue too that, is Beret Pri Hagafen simply a prayer over grapes, like we'd say a prayer over tangerines, or is it more holy because it's the first line of Kiddush, right? So I mean, so when you say Beret Pri Hagafen on a Monday, it's different than saying it on Shabbat. See, so I mean, you can kind of look at it a lot of different ways.
You say it, but you would say it anytime you would drink wine, would you not?
But I think it would be, you're exactly right, but I think it would be different on a Monday than on a Shabbat or a Yom Tov.
Give my ignorance about a lot of the blessings that we use, but what about blessings over other foods besides the motzi, where we just sit down and do we say the Asher Kiddishanu b'mitzvato b'tzivanu for anything that we eat?
No.
So whatever we're talking about wouldn't necessarily just have to do with this particular blessing. It would have to do with all that God created that's put before us, for which we say thanks. We don't have to do anything. There's no commandment to eat it. But we certainly are grateful to have it, and it doesn't have to be just the wine.
When you make this blessing over the wine, are you blessing God for the entire thing, for the wine, or are you simply blessing God for the fact that he produced the grape, which then we took to make the wine?
That's my point too, is anything that we eat there had to be an initial creation of it for us to take it and use it. We don't eat the flour raw, we make bread out of it. We don't.
But you can eat an apple raw.
Right, but that's my point, is that we can say this same blessing and praise God for giving us an apple or an orange or like a tangerine, like Don said, or it doesn't necessarily have to be this blessing. We're praising and giving thanks for all that he created for us, for our sustenance. Or she created.
Since we've already started moving in this direction, Don, would you read our next text, please?
Praise to you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who brings forth bread from the ground.
All right.
This is the blessing over bread. It gives God credit for bringing forth bread from the earth, but God doesn't actually do that. Instead, God helps the wheat to grow and gives us the ingenuity to turn wheat into bread. We are God's partners in improving creation. It is said that our talents are God's gift to us, and what we do with them is our gift to God. Does this way of thinking about God work for you?
Well, if you think about it as a gift to God, then it almost sounds like it's a commandment that we eat it. We make it and we eat it because he provided it, and by gosh, you're going to eat it or not leave the table.
I guess it's like an appreciation in a sense. You know, when you put it that way, Carol, that's very interesting. It shows we're appreciating God's efforts.
Is there a prayer that we praise God for giving us the ingenuity or the ability to take what he gives us and make it useful?
Not one that I know of is specifically about that. But that doesn't mean that you can't say thanks to God for God giving you the skills and ideas to do whatever. There are the Keva prayers that are fixed and the Kavanah prayers that are spontaneous. And God understands English.
Well, don't we have a prayer, David, I think in the morning liturgy, for thanking God for our intellect? When we talk about being able to differentiate between night and day or between, the coming of the dawn.
That's true. That's true.
I was just wondering if that could be kind of, interpreted more broadly to say that's thanking God for our intellect.
Yeah, we do have that. And we also have in the weekday Amidah, the first of the middle blessings after the Kiddush. Thanks God and asks for additional wisdom.
Mhm.
The Tachanan paragraph. So that could also be along the lines of what you're talking about, Carol.
David, where does, when God gave our ancestors manna from heaven, and then, in the Torah it says, it's also a reflection that you can't live by bread alone. So how does that fit into this?
So I'm not sure that one would say Motzi over manna, setting aside the fact that these blessings are a rabbinic thing and they were invented long after the Israelites stopped receiving manna. Hypothetically, like if the question were what blessing does one say over manna, on the one hand, this blessing brings forth bread from the ground and manna fell from the heavens. On the other hand, we say motzi over any substance that is being used as bread. So if manna were being used as bread, then one could argue that one would say motzi over it, depending on how one defines using it as bread. I'm not sure if that actually answers your question, though.
No, not exactly.
All right, why don't you restate the question? I'll have another go at it.
Well, I guess what I'm saying here is that, in essence, this is saying that we're praising God for and thanking God for the things that we can't control. And so I think that, manna is another thing that was a gift that we had no control over. So, I mean,
so that
but,
feels like
we're doing this, but making bread is a partnership. Manna was not a partnership. That was just a total gift.
Yeah.
David, I'm particularly fond of this comment you have. It is said that our talents are God's gift to us, and what we do with them is our gift to God. And in fact, I just happen to have that in a wonderful little gift that somebody gave me, written very creatively. But what I think of this and why I happen to particularly like this statement is that, to me, it sounds like we can serve God in many ways and through using our talents to serve others. And that's why it's important to develop our talents and to use them creatively. So whether your gift is in baking bread or challah, or whether your gift is in sewing or gardening or making friends with somebody who's lonely or whatever it is, that there are many things that we can do besides saying prayers, in addition to saying prayers, to serve God. So thank you for including that in this.
No problem. All right, other thoughts about this?
David, I was thinking, gets a little back to what we talked about with the prayer over grapes versus Kiddush and Motzi, because I'm thinking at the Pesach Seder, before we eat the matzah, we do an Asher Kitshana B'Mitzvah blessing, even though matzah and bread are made out of the same ingredients, basically. So, I mean, any comments or any thoughts on, is that like considered elevating a prayer a little bit from the traditional one? I'm just kind of curious if there's other instances of that in our liturgy, or just anyone's thoughts on that point.
Yeah, so that's an interesting situation because Don is referring to the Motzi Matzah steps when we say the Motzi blessing over eating the matzah, and then we follow that up before we eat the matzah with an Asher Kishem Mitzvah V'Tzivani blessing al achilat matzah, on the eating of matzah. So the bread, or the thing being used as bread, does not get an Asher Kishem Mitzvah blessing. It's just a straight thank you, God. And then the matzah specifically is something that we're commanded to eat in the Torah. So that's a doing thing. So it's a juxtaposition of both types of blessings.
Sense.
All right, let's go on. Moving on to wrestling with God. Helen, would you please read this text?
Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the break of dawn. When he saw that he had not prevailed against him, he wrenched Jacob's hip at its socket, so that the socket of his hip was strained as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for dawn is breaking." But he answered, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." Said the other, "What is your name?" He replied, "Jacob." Said he, "Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with beings divine and human and have prevailed." Jacob asked, "Pray tell me your name." But he said, "You must not ask my name." And he took leave of him there. This is from the book of Genesis. Jacob had tricked his brother Esau out of Esau's birthright and blessing 20 years prior to this text. And now that Jacob was coming home, Esau was coming to meet him with 400 of Esau's closest friends. The night before they meet, Jacob sends his family across a stream in case Esau tries a night attack, and Jacob wrestles all night. It is unclear if Jacob is wrestling with Esau. Doesn't explain why the name change involves wrestling with a divine being, or with Jacob's own conscience. Doesn't explain why he sustains a physical hip injury. Or with an angel, Esau's guardian angel, or some other angel. The key point is that Jacob's name changes to Israel, the God wrestler. As descendants of Jacob or Israel, we get to wrestle with God, and that's okay. Does this way of thinking about God work for you?
Thank you.
That way we have so many hip replacements today.
I've always liked this passage. I think because as soon as I began to seriously try to study Torah in groups, it seems that's what we're doing. It seems like we're wrestling with God.
That's a good way to put it.
Mhm.
I mean, it would be a lot easier if there was just, one way of doing things, one way of interpreting things, one way of reading things, but it wouldn't be as much fun. It wouldn't be as interesting. And we would be, I don't think we would be who we are as a people if we didn't have that wrestling with God.
We could read Torah with only one way of interpreting it. Talmud would never have been written, and the sages never become sages.
Yep.
And you and I are still doing it today.
Right. Keeps our minds working.
2 Jews, 3 opinions, right?
Yeah.
This physical interaction is, if it would be God, it's distinct from any of the interactions that other people have, or players are in the protagonists in the Bible have. Abraham has some communications, or spiritually, or these 3 messengers come to visit him prior to advising him about Sarah, and Moses has some exchanges of communication and possibly sees, according to the Torah readings, that God's back, or is that figurative? Is it all figurative? So this is in that sense, to me, it stands out from the other interactions. And why in particular would it be Jacob? I mean, consider that he used some subterfuges to steal his brother's birthright, and then he goes off and comes back. But the particular privilege that he would have of being the one that actually come into physical contact and have his name changed. I mean, it just I'm sitting here puzzling about that.
And the fact that it's changed Israel, which refers to the entire people from that moment forward, is pretty
Correct.
significant. Especially for somebody you describe that, shall we say, has a few flaws in his familiar relationships.
Maybe it's because Jacob was a thief, if you will, and people would not have accepted him as being one of our forefathers or a very important man if there wasn't a direct physical interaction with divine being. This way, he was raised, in our eyes at least, to become.
Right, because now my question is, what else did he, what separated him from the others? That was my question, that he would deserve or merit that particular interaction or experience.
Needed him to have 12 sons, 12 tribes to start the nation of Israel.
So, all right, so he was prolific.
Maybe he was the first, but everybody wrestles with God in some way or other. Don't you think?
Yes. I have no doubt about that. Some people to a greater or lesser degree. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's what some of the uniqueness, I mean, I don't know a lot about other religions, but some of the uniqueness of Judaism is we don't have a dogma per se. I mean, because we're continually, wrestling with God, challenging God is encouraged, as you can see here. I mean, in Jacob's case, it made him, the parent of the entire people going forward, in addition to the 12 sons. So, I mean, I think it's very significant in our whole legacy, if you will, this whole wrestling, whether it's a metaphor or not, this whole wrestling, I think, is very, very significant.
Oh, undoubtedly, the symbolism there is sharp. It's clear. That I understand, but I was just wondering. A thought that came through my mind: why this particular gentleman and or swindler? I don't want to use the word swindler, but someone who did some. Well, it really wasn't him. It was his mother. But he did what his mother told him to do.
It's interesting because he has all, like you said, we've been talking about, he gets all this, if you will, glory and all this going forward. And Moses, who is such a great leader, is punished and not allowed to enter the promised land. So the balance here doesn't work for me a little bit. You know what I mean?
No, that's what's perplexing to me. But aside from the illustration that someone had to go through some very thought-provoking and consideration. Is he going to move forward? Is he going to be the patriarch or not? What other choice do you have? I mean, Esau is just going off and killing. He's a hunter, and Jacob was the one who stayed close to home, was cooking the food and doing this and that, more of a domestic type of a person. So is there more to it that way, that the type of that would characterize us as a religion or as a people?
Maybe that's where their talents lie. Everybody has different talents, and to use them for God.
Every other religion seems to hold God in awe as far off and somebody they bow down to all the time, if you will. We tend to, as you say, wrestle with God, question God, argue with God. Does that make us closer to God than the other religions?
Or is that we feel we have a more intimate communication?
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
It's also timely too, because it's Rosh Chodesh Elul, so we're focusing on the High Holy Days, and that's probably the one time of year when our metaphor of God changes a bit from God as our friend and our peer and somebody to argue that you can wrestle with and argue with, to our liturgy at the High Holy Days, which makes God, such a high sovereign, such a master, and we bow more in our service during the High Holy Days than any other time of the year. So again, it's kind of an interesting juxtaposition, I think. the way we look at God most of the time and the way we're going to be looking at God as we approach this upcoming season.
Jim, what were you going to say? Jim, were you trying to say something?
No, I more or less was adding to the voices that said, when, God, we wrestle with God, it's the idea, that we're able to be closer to God than others.
It just occurred to me, maybe it's a moment where Jacob and I had to decide, does he move forward and encounter Esau? Does he move forward and then actually become the patriarch instead of Esau? As Esau had family too, had children. So is that a great decision? Am I going to move forward and to continue? To be the continuum of the relation between God and man as we move through as the people develops and expands. Do I or don't I? He was worried about Esau. What was the encounter going to be like? Does he have enough courage to go forward with it, or to back off and retreat? So does it have to do with also following your religion and the faith you have? I'm speculating. I'm just throwing out ideas that are coming to my head now, just because of how you folks are stimulating my thought process a bit.
I think the last point is very interesting to me. I think the notion of wrestling with God is very productive one, but we shouldn't overstate how it works in our liturgy, which is full of praise and unqualified bowing down, and a lot of people who read it just as it is find it downright embarrassing and wonder what it's grounded in. And so if we think about that, we think on the high holidays, we often quote from Levi Yitzchak Berdichev, because he does argue with God famously in those texts, but that's not the liturgy. That's him going outside it. And it's interesting that there's a tendency to quote that in some places. But it strikes me is that this story and on the whole story of Jacob and his trickster behavior and so on is, I think, very much in the rabbinical commentary. Correct me if I'm wrong. Is cleaned up. I get this partly from reading the Chumash that they use at Chabad, in which Jacob is treated like a person of sterling character and just pulled out of the text, even though you read the contrary all the time. There's a need to clean him up and not to have this wrestling, except where the text absolutely requires it. That's also true about the story of David.
How do they explain his taking the birthright away from his brother?
I'm not competent to answer that question, but there isn't a lot of worrying about that. They have in their Chumash commentary, all kinds of tiny points are addressed that are logically puzzling, but I think that's one that isn't. I could be wrong.
All right, let's take on our next text. Carol, would you read this, please?
Now the Lord had said, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do, since Abraham is to become a great and populous nation, and all the nations are to bless themselves by him? For I have singled him out, that he may instruct his children and his posterity to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is just and right, in order that the Lord may bring about for Abraham what he has promised him. Then the Lord said, the outrage of Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin is so grave. I will go down to see whether they have acted altogether according to the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will take note. The men went on from there to Sodom, while Abraham remained standing before the Lord. Abraham came forward and said, will you sweep away the innocent along with the guilty? What if there should be 50 innocent within the city? Will you then wipe out the place and not forgive it for the sake of the innocent 50 who are in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to bring death upon the innocent as well as the guilty, so that innocent and guilty fare alike. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth deal justly? And the Lord answered, if I find within the city of Sodom 50 innocent ones, I will forgive the whole place for their sake. Abraham spoke up, saying, here I venture to speak to my Lord, I who am but dust and ashes. What if the 50 innocent should lack 5? Will you destroy the whole city for want of the 5? And God answered, I will not destroy if I find 45 there. But he spoke to him again and said, what if 40 should be found there? And God answered, I will not do it for the sake of the 40. Said, let not my Lord be angry if I go on. What if 30 should be found there? And God answered, I will not do it if I find 30 there. And he said, I venture again to speak to my Lord. What if 20 should be found there? And God answered, I will not destroy for the sake of the 20. And he said, let not my Lord be angry if I speak, but this last time, what if 10 should be found there? And God answered, I will not destroy for the sake of the 10. When the Lord had finished speaking to Abraham, God departed, and Abraham returned to his place. This is from the biblical book of Genesis, where God tells Abraham that God is going to destroy the wicked cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham has the chutzpah, the gumption, to argue with God and say that God is making a mistake. After God agrees to not destroy the cities if 50 good people are found, if 50 good people are found there, Abraham has the further chutzpah to keep arguing God down. As the descendants of Abraham, we get to tell God what we think when we think God is wrong, though God may not respond. Does this way of thinking about God work for you?
When speaking of the 50, Abraham said, will you destroy the 50 along with the wicked, destroying the city? And it came down to there was only one righteous man there. Yet that righteous man wasn't destroyed. He was allowed to escape. But it didn't sound like the 50 would have been allowed to escape. Isn't there a dichotomy there? Or is the translation wrong?
Well, he doesn't say what he'll do to allow the 50 or the 40 or the 30 to be taken out of the fray. So maybe if there had been more conversation, he would have said, I won't do it. I'll make sure that they get to safety first. And then, we don't.
It says to bring death upon the innocent as well as the guilty, so that the innocent and guilty fare alike.
Yeah, it says here, I will forgive the whole place for their sake.
Right.
That means everybody. So not everybody would have been killed or destroyed for this, or the city destroyed.
Right. But why was Lot allowed to leave and not be destroyed with the rest of the city? The 50 would have been destroyed if God had said no.
Well, wasn't he behaving ethically, or was just because he was Abraham's relative?
Have an answer. It seems like it's a dichotomy of some kind.
How does that apply to today and today's hospital COVID wards, where there is so much prayer to let somebody or other live? Does there have a connection here with arguing with God to say, I will do such and such if you allow my son or daughter or husband and wife to live? Do
It's
we,
not,
How come people who are caring for the sick are also contacting the COVID and dying? Any of them?
Mhm.
What about the people who are caring for the sick, who are angry with the sick as well because they weren't vaccinated? And they're, that brings another question.
when do you get to, I've always said, when will the doctors get to the point that there's so many, they say, hey, you don't take care of yourself.
Yeah, too bad.
I mean, what can I do for you? It's the same if I stop taking a medication. The doctor says it's your choice. You can or you can't. If you can't, you're making that decision. What can I do for you? But now we're getting off track.
Well, the problem with that is that then you're making the assumption that people, it's just like AIDS 40 years ago, that COVID is a plague for evil people. I mean, God is making it clear in Genesis that he's planning to punish the cities and the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah for their evil ways. So I don't really think we can use that for the COVID situation. I just have to put that in.
That's true. That's true.
As Carol was reading, I began picturing what Abraham talking to God. And all I could picture is Abraham's there and he's talking to what? Did he see God? Did he, I mean, he's having this conversation with a voice.
Voice out of
And
nowhere.
Hmm?
A voice out of nowhere.
A voice out of nowhere.
Or you're just perceiving something that you see, that it's not necessarily sound waves, but just something that comes across in he senses it, the brain, for some, to be my engineer, some electromagnetic way or whatever way, just being, how do you feel if you ever feel you've been influenced or contacted by something that's not human, some other being that's not human? Do you ever sense that?
No.
Or through a dream? No.
I see a parallel between this story and the blessings that we talked about first, in that we were to work with God to create bread and create wine. And here, Abraham is working with God by arguing with him, perhaps, but to create, oh, good grief.
Even like it'll rain, it started to maybe rain and then it stopped. And then sort of maybe gonna rain. And now just big fat drops just there. The weather is not emotional.
I mean, I think because Abraham and God are arguing, it doesn't, in my mind, doesn't necessarily mean it's an argument between equals. In other words, he's not face to face with God like you and I could have an argument, kind of thing. So even though there's permission, if you will, or we recognize the fact that as humans we can argue with our God, it's not saying that it's on an equal footing, because it's not necessarily saying that Abraham, it's probably deliberate why it doesn't, that Abraham is facing God for this argument about Sodom and Gomorrah the way I would face Carol right now if I was in the same room and we have an argument about something. So it's an argument, but it's not between equals. I think in our society, we're used to arguments between equals, in a sense. See what I mean? I mean, the way you argue with your friend is different than the way you argue with your boss at work, let's say. Well, I think it's a little bit different between God and Abraham. That's just my thought.
Down at the throne, you connect with him by Zoom.
Argument via Zoom, I like it.
Yeah. Well, other folks, they have their communications through dreams.
In a way, it's representative of what our whole relationship with God and our religion is, that Abraham is challenging God. He's taking the liberty, like we do, to question. We obviously, we can talk to God. You know, I could stand in here in my living room and saying, how come this and how come that? And why are you doing this when I have a very sick friend or something going on? It's a challenge, and we're being given permission to challenge him. So it's sort of the same way as the blessing. I mean, we're being grateful to him, and we let him know. And if we're not happy about something, Abraham isn't happy about something, he's letting him know about it. He wants God to prove to him that he's being fair. And so
Going on a little bit because I'm not a parent, but so I don't know what this is like, but I mean, if you have adult children and they argue with you, and it's a good argument, in a sense, even though you might have a disagreement, are you not proud of them? Because it shows that you brought them up well if they're able to argue. So maybe that's the way this Abraham God challenge, as you said, Carol, I love that word, it's true. It's almost like a parent kind of taking pride in what they produced because that person is able to argue intelligently and passionately. Does that make sense?
does that make a parent God in the eyes of the child?
Well, that's where it falls apart, because I'm not a parent, so nobody's ever looked at me that way. But my point is, you don't get, I assume you don't look down on your child because they argue with you. You don't usually consider that a sign of disrespect. I mean, you consider it the fact that they're maturing, and it's like agreeing to disagree. And I see some of that in this exchange between God and Abraham.
You allowed to argue with a parent if the commandment says honor thy father and mother?
But you can sort of bargain with them. You can ask them questions. What if you then try to use some logic to convince without being disobedient? And I think that's what Abraham was doing. It's more like he was asking if it was logic or haggling a bit and coming back and bargaining, like a youngster will say, oh, just let me stay up another 15 minutes. It's too early to go to bed. What's the harm in that? Or I don't have to go to school tomorrow, so why can't I stay up a little bit later?
Yeah, it's like negotiation in a sense.
Yeah.
Like which is actually assigning human traits to God, which we do all the time, because if God is ultimately the judge and the ruler, then there'd be no space for argument or challenges. So that's the other side of it, where it's not the God-parent relationship. So it can go both ways.
In the sentence, it says Abraham has the chutzpah, the gumption. I don't think chutzpah and gumption are the same thing. Chutzpah is more in your face or taking like gall, insulting. Gumption is more of
It's a softer term.
it's a softer way of saying it.
Initiative, in character.
Right.
Yeah. Energy.
Chutzpah is more sassy, and
yeah.
So it's got two different words there that doesn't work for me.
All right.
Abraham acts as a guarantor for the Jewish community, or the community that Sodom and Gomorrah. He's taking a risk on Sodom and Gomorrah in going out in front and saying, "Hey, I'm willing to vouch for this community if there are 10 righteous people." that's a real risk for Abraham. Abraham is basically saying he bears some responsibility for this community shaping up if there are 10 mensches in the community, and that's a very small core of righteous people to bring Gomorrah back on its feet, to not be basically a place of killing and murder and death.
Yep.
Low bar, that's a good point. I mean, I don't know what the population was in those years, but sounds like 50 is totally a drop in the bucket.
And 10 is less of a drop in the bucket. No.
It's very striking that in this story, there seems to be a clear notion that what is just and right is just and right, and that God ought to also follow that, which is not obvious. And there is, ancient literature about whether what's pleasing to the gods, whether something is pleasing to the gods because it is just, or whether it's just because it is pleasing to the gods. And here a certain position is staked out in that, which is really breathtaking, no matter how many times we read it.